Hello, my fellow weirdlings! It's Margot, and today I'm back with more real-life Halloween horror stories. So if you're ready to get spooked and spine-tingled, keep watching. Though I won't be going into explicit detail, the following true crime stories cover sensitive topics that may be triggering to some. On Halloween in 1955, Marilyn Damman took her 2-year-old son Stephen and 7-month-old daughter Pamela to a bakery in East Meadow, New York, for some fresh bread. At 2:45 p.m., Marilyn left Stephen and Pamela, who was in her stroller, outside the store, where several other strollers were parked. As she'd done many times before, Marilyn told Stephen to be good and that she'd be back in just a few minutes. 10 minutes later, Marilyn exited the store and was horrified to find both of her kids and her stroller missing. Marilyn was adamant that little Stephen never wandered and wouldn't have been able to move the stroller by himself. The stroller was eventually found a few blocks away, with baby Pamela safe inside, but Stephen was nowhere to be found. Marilyn was rushed to the hospital and treated for shock, while a search party of 2,000 volunteers, along with personnel from Mitchell Field, Boy Scouts, police officers, and firemen, was organized. A missing person poster described Stephen as 38 inches tall, weighing 32 pounds, with blonde hair and blue eyes, a scar under his chin, and a birthmark resembling a mole on the back of his lower calf. He was last seen wearing blue overalls, a blue polo shirt, a red sweater with white and blue ships on the front, and brown shoes. Posters were distributed across the city. Police officers drove Marilyn throughout the city in a sound truck. As they drove, she yelled, "Stevie, where are you?" over the speaker. She and Stephen's father, Jerry, an airman at the base at Long Island's Mitchell Field, pleaded on national television for their son's return. They said Stephen suffered from anemia and needed to take medications, including vitamins, aspirin, and a tonic. A month later, the Dammans received 3 ransom notes. The first requested $3,000. The second requested $10,000. Then the third requested $14,000. They soon discovered the letters were a fraud. Over the years, DNA testing has been utilized in an attempt to determine if Stephen Damman was ever given a new identity. At one point, investigators noticed that Stephen bore a resemblance to the infamous boy in the box, an unidentified child who was found murdered inside a cardboard box in Philadelphia in 1957. Using Stephen's sister's DNA, this theory was ruled out in 2003. There were also several reports of a female hitchhiker with a small boy resembling Stephen in Minneapolis. There was another claim of a woman and boy who looked like Stephen in a tavern in Kansas. None of the leads ever panned out. In 2009, a Michigan man named John Barnes told police he suspected he may be Stephen Damman. Barnes looked strikingly similar to Jerry Damman and gave the family a glimmer of hope. Barnes told Jerry he was too young to remember anything from that time frame and said the family who raised him had never suggested he was anything other than their biological son. However, he'd never felt as though he was part of the family he was brought up in and started looking into missing person cases, where he came across that of Stephen Damman. Barnes' claims were taken seriously, and his DNA was tested at the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia. Tests confirmed the family that raised Barnes was indeed his biological family. As of August 2021, Stephen Damman is still missing. His disappearance is classified as a non-family abduction. On Halloween night, 1981, 39-year-old photographer Ronald Sisman invited his girlfriend, 20-year-old student Elizabeth Platzman, to his third-floor apartment in a Manhattan duplex near Greenwich Village for a photo shoot. He used this location as both his residence and his 2 photography businesses. Relaxing with a bottle of wine, they heard a knock at the door. They opened the door to find what's thought to have been multiple assailants pushing their way into the apartment. The couple was then severely beaten before being shot in the back of their heads, execution style. The duplex was ransacked as if the killers were looking for something, though nothing appeared to be missing except a handgun belonging to Sisman. There were no signs of forced entry. Sisman had recently applied for 2 gun permits because someone had previously broken into his apartment and he'd feared for his safety. The murder was presumed to be drug-related, as there had been a claim that Sisman had tried to force actress Melanie Haller to take drugs while working with him, but that case was later dropped when Haller declined to cooperate with investigators. Police found themselves seemingly at a dead end when an informant called them with a bizarre story, saying someone he knew had predicted the murder weeks before it had happened. That someone was none other than David Berkowitz, the serial killer known as the Son of Sam. Berkowitz had killed 6 people and wounded 9 others in New York City over the course of a year in 1976 and 1977. At the time of the Sisman and Platzman murders, Berkowitz was behind bars for his crimes. He'd long since claimed he was only partly responsible for the killings attributed to him, claiming to be part of a satanic cult. He'd also initially claimed a neighbor's dog was possessed by an ancient spirit that commanded him to shoot people. The dog's owner's name was Sam. Berkowitz later admitted that story had been a lie. The informant told police that Berkowitz had told him a couple weeks prior to the murders of Sisman and Platzman that his cult was going to perform a ritual killing on Halloween. He described the location as a photographer's residence near Greenwich Village. He said they'd kill the occupants, then clean the residence of any incriminating evidence against the cult. Berkowitz claimed that Sisman had a video of the final Son of Sam killing of victim Stacy Moskowitz that would shed light on the cult and make people rethink that Berkowitz had acted alone. He said Sisman had been hired by the cult to record the video, but they hadn't told him what the film would be about beforehand. Afterwards, Sisman was seemingly upset about what he'd taken part in. The cult had heard rumors that Sisman may be in trouble for dealing drugs and that he might use the video as leverage to cut a deal with authorities. The police contacted Berkowitz, and he gave an eerily accurate description of Sisman's residence and the details of the crime. Nobody has ever been charged with the Sisman and Platzman murders. In 1977, the parents of 19-month-old Nema Louise Carter put her to bed on Halloween night as they did on every other night, made sure the house was locked up, and went to bed. The next morning, Nema's horrified mother, Rose, found her baby's crib empty. The door to the Carters' home remained securely locked, but little Nema had vanished. Because the windows in her room were also locked, it was believed her abductor must have been hiding in the closet. A month later, little Nema's parents were even more heartbroken when she was found dead in a refrigerator in an old abandoned house nearby. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Both Rose and Nema's father, George, passed lie detector tests that confirmed they weren't responsible for their daughter's abduction or death, leaving police with the difficult mystery to solve. But before Nema's disappearance, there had been a couple incidents that pointed to someone sinister lurking in the small town of Lawton, Oklahoma. 2 months before Nema's abduction, their family dog had been found dead of poisoning. A year earlier, someone had burglarized their home and stolen pictures of baby Nema, which they found thrown around outside. An even freakier connection was that a year and a half earlier, twin girls Mary Elizabeth and Augustine Lena Carpenter had been lured from their home by their babysitter, Jackie Robidoux. The twins had been taken to an abandoned house and locked in an old refrigerator. 2 days later, local children heard cries for help and discovered Augustine barely clinging to life. Mary had suffocated and died. Augustine was adamant that their babysitter was responsible, but it took 3 years for Robidoux to be convicted. During that time, Robidoux regularly babysat Rose and George Carter's baby, Nema. When she was finally charged with the murder of Mary and abduction of Augustine, Robidoux refused to admit to Nema's abduction. She was given life in prison in 1979 and died there of cirrhosis of the liver in 2005 at the age of 46, taking anything she knew about the death of Nema Carter with her. Oddly, George Carter was never convinced the killer babysitter had anything to do with Nema's death. Other family members disagree and think Robidoux is the most likely culprit. At around 11 p.m. on Halloween night in 1957, 35-year-old Los Angeles hairstylist Peter Fabiano, roused from bed, grumpily answered his doorbell. Expecting to see a straggling trick-or-treater, he asked, "It's a little late for this, isn't it?" as he pulled open the door. Instead of a mischievous kid, he was greeted by a costumed adult, disguised with a grotesque, garishly painted face, with a domino mask and what were considered men's clothing: blue jeans, a khaki jacket, and red gloves. His unwelcome visitor, holding up a paper bag that concealed a gun, answered no with a deceptively deep voice, promptly shot him in the chest with both shaky hands gripping the gun, and ran away. Upon hearing the gunshot, Peter's 39-year-old wife, Betty, frantically rushed to his side. By all accounts, they were the perfect couple leading up to this night, with good looks, 2 successful beauty shops, a nice home, and Betty's 2 teenage children from a previous marriage. Everyone thought they had it all by 1950 standards. Betty stayed by Peter's side while her 15-year-old daughter, Judy, ran to a neighbor 2 doors down, who was a member of the Los Angeles Police Department. Police officers arrived at the Fabiano house within minutes. Peter was rushed to a nearby hospital, but he never woke up. Betty was sedated for several days before agreeing to speak to the police. Betty told police she'd heard 2 voices that night, one masculine and one like a man impersonating a woman. The only person Betty could think of that disliked Peter was a family friend named Joan, though she was sure they had no real enemies. Police picked Joan up but quickly released her due to lack of evidence. Dubbed the trick-or-treat murder in the press, the seemingly senseless shooting gained a lot of attention with local newspapers. Who would want to harm a well-liked family man like Peter Fabiano? Nobody would have ever expected that answer to be Goldine Pizer. The 43-year-old widowed Children's Hospital lab assistant was described as bookish and matronly. While Goldine's life was a seemingly open book of mediocrity, her friend, and the only name that came to Betty Fabiano's mind when asked who'd want to kill her husband, Joan Rabel's life is shrouded in mystery. What we do know is the 40-year-old divorced freelance photographer had been working for Peter Fabiano at his salon. That's where Joan met Peter's wife, Betty. They became close, and Joan became a beloved family friend. This got murky when Joan began to claim Betty had told her that Peter was secretly abusive and controlling. Joan began to obsess about rescuing Betty from Peter. It's said that at one point, Betty even stayed with Joan briefly while working through marital problems, and that when the Fabianos reconciled, it was on the condition that Betty cut off all contact with Joan. It's thought this is when Joan began to build the twisted relationship that would ultimately end Peter's life. A few months before the shooting, Joan began telling her friend Goldine all about the Fabianos and Peter's evil behavior. Over the course of 3 months, Joan convinced Goldine to kill Peter, giving her money to buy a gun, providing her with the clothes she'd wear to commit the murder, and borrowing a getaway car from another friend. Later, Goldine told police, "She told me that Mr. Fabiano was a vile, evil man, a man who destroyed everything around him. She told me that he mistreated his wife and that he was dealing narcotics. She said they'd driven by the Fabiano house a couple weeks before the shooting, so she'd recognize him." That Halloween night, Joan drove Goldine to the Fabiano house, listened as a shot rang out, then took her shaken friend home, with stops along the way to burn their clothes and return the car to its owner. Joan left Goldine with one last instruction: "Forget you ever knew me." The next morning, Goldine realized Joan had neglected to give her directions for disposing of the .38 Smith & Wesson revolver, so she took it to Bullock's flagship store in downtown Los Angeles and stashed it in a rented storage locker. 2 weeks later, detectives discovered the gun after receiving an anonymous tip and questioned Goldine, who admitted to everything. Both Goldine and Joan were promptly arrested. In court, Goldine seemed very remorseful for her crime, while Joan sat expressionless, sometimes smiling nonchalantly, declining to testify. Goldine initially pled not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that Joan had basically cast some sort of spell over her. The women were examined by 3 psychiatrists. Goldine told one of them, "I had no motive personally. Whatever motive I had was to please Joan. I was always easily influenced. I have been impressionable and always trusting." The psychiatrist wrote, "The only thought she had was that she had saved her friend, Joan Rabel, from an evil person." They both pled guilty and were sentenced to 5 years to life in prison for a reduced charge of second-degree murder, though it's unclear how much time they actually served. Reports say Joan smiled as she left the courtroom. During the trial, it was never explicitly said, but Goldine seemed to allude to being in love with Joan, while Joan was completely infatuated with Betty. Newspapers of the time used mid-century euphemisms for lesbianism during a time when homosexuality was illegal in California, and many rumors about the true nature of the relationships between the 3 women still abound to this day. One such seemingly unsubstantiated rumor is that Betty actually was the mastermind behind the entire plot to get her husband out of the way. Many people believe Joan's unrequited obsession with Betty was the driving force behind the whole thing, and she made up the stories of Peter's abusive nature to get Goldine on board. I suppose we'll never know for sure. Goldine died in 1998. Betty sold the salon after Peter's death and remarried in 1966. She died in 1999 at the age of 81. Nobody knows what happened to Joan. She seems to have vanished like a Halloween ghost. On Halloween 2010 in Martin, Ohio, 16-year-old Devin Griffin returned home from attending a Sunday morning church service and went up to his room to play video games. At around 1:30 p.m., Devin began to wonder why nobody else in the family was out of bed yet. He went downstairs to the master bedroom, belonging to his 46-year-old mother Susan and 53-year-old stepfather Bill, and found them uncharacteristically still in bed, the maroon comforter pulled up over their heads. Devin started casually talking to his mom to wake her, then noticed her foot sticking out from beneath the covers. He tapped her on the leg and got no response. Continuing to talk to Susan, Devin pulled the comforter down a little and realized his mother's pillow was soaked with blood. For a second, Devon thought this must be a Halloween prank, but he quickly realized his family members had been murdered. He ran out of the house crying. He later said the scene was like something out of a haunted house. Devon called his aunt for help, who called 911. Detectives found William and Susan Liske shot to death in their bed. William had been shot 5 times in the head and face. Susan had been sexually assaulted and then shot 3 times at close range. Devon's 23-year-old brother, Derek Griffin, was found upstairs in his locked bedroom, curled up in bed facing the wall. Derek was also deceased as a result of blunt force trauma. Investigators found a bloody claw hammer in the house, as well as muddy footprints near the family's pond on the deck, leading police to believe this was where the gun had been disposed of, but the pond was drained and no weapon found. The immediate suspect in the crime was 24-year-old William Liske Jr., known as BJ. Devon had spent the previous night at the home of his biological father and had returned to his mother's house that morning to change into his church clothes. He recalled seeing his stepbrother BJ at the house that morning, but had thought nothing of it. BJ had a long history of mental illness and violence, especially toward his stepmother Susan. He'd been institutionalized multiple times in attempts to get him help. It's said that his father refused to give up on him. Susan had tried to impose order in the house since marrying Bill, with rules and boundaries, which BJ strongly resented. BJ and his stepbrother Derek had never got along. The week before the murders, Bill Liske Sr. had taken some vacation time to take BJ deer hunting. They'd returned home less than 24 hours before the murders took place. After returning from the hunting trip, Bill and BJ got together with friends for a few beers. Bill had BJ spend the night, as they'd been drinking and it wasn't safe to drive him back to the Sandusky group home for mental health patients, where he'd been living. The couch had been made up for him to sleep on. Neighbors were wary of BJ and had suspected him of killing and torturing neighborhood pets. One neighbor told investigators she'd heard what sounded like gunshots at about 6:30 a.m. After Devon saw BJ that morning, BJ had taken the family's Ford F-150 truck and drove it to the hunting cabin he and his dad had just returned from. He was there less than an hour before Carroll County Sheriff's deputies arrested him. William Liske Jr. pleaded guilty in 2011 to 3 counts of aggravated murder. In exchange for this plea, prosecutors dropped the death sentence and recommended Liske be sentenced to life without parole. In 2015, Liske was found dead in his prison cell at age 29 from a self-inflicted injury. On Halloween night in 1981 in Amarillo, Texas, 76-year-old nun Sister Tadia Benz was sound asleep in her second-story St. Francis convent bedroom when she awoke to a vicious attack. She was sexually assaulted, stabbed, and strangled to death. Early the next morning, another nun in the house found the sister's nude body on the floor of her bedroom, arms outstretched, and assumed she had died of natural causes. She testified that she had gone into shock and couldn't think of what to do next. 4 other nuns testified that they'd wrapped Sister Tadia's body in a sheet, believing she'd died in a fall, and cleaned up spots of blood on the floor near her body. Later, they noticed a broken window in their community room and called the police for that, thinking a break-in must have occurred. At that time, they still didn't think it was pertinent to tell the police about Sister Tadia's death. When police overheard the nuns discussing it, of course it piqued their interest and they began an investigation. An autopsy revealed the horror of what really ended the sister's life. Police found Sister Tadia's clothing and a knife under her bed. An additional kitchen knife was found in the convent's driveway. 11 days later, 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett, who lived across the street from the convent, was arrested for the crime. Authorities were already familiar with Garrett for previously committing petty crimes. Police said he had left fingerprints and was seen running from the scene on the night of the murder. The knife found in the driveway also resembled a knife found in Garrett's home. Garrett admitted to being at the convent earlier that evening, looking for items to steal. Though he swore he was innocent of the violent crime, Garrett was convicted and sentenced to death. On February 11, 1992, despite still maintaining his innocence, Garrett was executed by a lethal injection. After a last meal of ice cream, and reportedly the last words, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me, and the rest of the world can kiss my ass." Since Garrett's execution, there have been various doubts raised surrounding his guilt, and an increasing number of people convinced of his innocence. Garrett's childhood was brutal, plagued by abuse, mental impairment, brain damage, and being forced to perform in child pornography. His family had introduced him to drugs and alcohol when he was just 10 years old. None of this information was presented to the jury at his trial. With Garrett's low IQ, criminal past, and inadequate representation, the prosecutor didn't have a difficult time convincing the jury of Garrett's guilt, and Garrett was unequipped to properly defend himself. While Garrett's fingerprints may have been at the convent, they weren't on the murder weapon. But the most compelling argument for Garrett's innocence is that a few months prior to the murder of Sister Tadia, 77-year-old Narnie Box Bryson was killed the same way. In 2004, DNA evidence taken from Sister Tadia's body identified a career criminal named Leoncio Perez Rueda. By that time, Rueda had already pled guilty and was convicted of the sexual assault and murder of Narnie Bryson and was serving a 45-year sentence. Many strongly believe Rueda was responsible for both crimes. It was said he'd even admitted to sexually assaulting and murdering a nun in his past. Additional evidence at the scene also linked Rueda to Sister Tadia's murder. Garrett's sisters and many others still maintain his innocence and are demanding he be exonerated. Some people believe Garrett and Rueda must have been working together, though there's no evidence to support that. It seems likely Texas may have executed an innocent young man. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed these stories and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends or enemies. And if you have an interesting story to share, I'll leave my contact info in the description box. Thanks so much for watching.